In this video, I'm going to show you how you can blur out the background in Photoshop from an image looking like this into an image looking like this. Let's go into the tutorial and I show you how I created that effect. So the first thing you should do is to duplicate the layer. Duplicate the layer, you right click on your background copy and say duplicate layer and duplicate it as background copy. You can name it as blur and press OK. So you've created another layer in Photoshop. When you create another layer in Photoshop, the second step, you should select your subject. When you're selecting your subject, the main principle is to separate the subject from the background. So this is what you're going to do. You're going to go into select on the toolbar and then press select and then subject. When you press the subject, Photoshop is going to automatically select the subject. Remember, I'm using Photoshop 2019, but if you have Photoshop 2021, this should be really very simple. This should be really very simple. So this, I'm going to wait for my Photoshop to select this subject. Remember, my Photoshop is a bit slow, but yours should be a bit faster. So when you look at this image really selected by Photoshop automatically, you realize that some parts are not selected. So I'm going to press my quick selection tool. I promise to make a video about selection later on my channel about selection. So I'm going to press my quick selection tool and go into this part which is not selected. I press alternative on my keyboard. When you press alternative on your keyboard, remember I commanded Photoshop to select the subject. But this time round, this area is selected, is within the bounded selections. So I'm going to press alternative and I get that minus and I keep on tapping, left clicking. This has been very easy for me. It has selected this area the way I wanted it to be selected. So you have to look through your subject to see whether there is no mistake made. This image, I took this image with a 50mm and I think I took this image at an aperture something like 2 point something. I'll check the details later, the XIF details later, to see how I took this. So I need to perfect my selection. I need to perfect my selection. You really need to see a video about how you perfect a selection in order to go on with the background blur thing. So I'm selecting my earring really well, as you can note. So I go through the image and I realize this image has been so easy. My previous images were a bit harder, whereby I needed to press the quick mask. What is a quick mask? You're going to tap into this video to realize what a quick mask is in selection. So when I tap into the quick mask, I have the liberty to select my subject using brushes. So it goes with the shortcut Q. When you press Q, you can go back. So if you look at this image, I have properly selected my background. So then my subject rather. So the next step is to separate my subject from the background. So what do? You go on a right click. When you right click, there comes options, lots of options. So I'm going to say layer via copy. When you press layer via copy, Photoshop is going to create another layer, but it is just copying it. It is just copying it from this layer. So when I press layer via copy, I'm going to get my layer 1. Layer 1, it has only the subject. So I can name it that subject. And I press enter. So I have my other layer, my third layer called subject. So what is the next step? The next step, you go onto the quick selection tool. When you go into the quick selection tool, you expand it. You can expand it by the bracket keys on the keyboard, or you can go and command your sizes accordingly. So I go on to I enlarge my selection tool, and then I do some rough selection. When I do some rough selection, I'm working with the layer which only has the subject. Let me show you something here, guys. So when you press alternative, you're going to see that my subject is on a blank background right now. So when I go back and after selecting my subject, you go onto the blur or the background copy layer and select that. Because when I select my layer, I'm working within the boundaries of that layer, not any other layer in the Photoshop. So I go into select, I go into modify, and then I press expand. So when I press expand, normally I work with 20 pixels. So by expanding, I'm going to be expanding my selection. So I'm going to expand this selection by 20 pixels. I press OK. When I press OK, you can see that my selection is expanded beyond the subject. So what am I going to do next? What I do next here, I'm going to I'm going to create another layer which only has the background. So I press the right click and then say fill, and then I say you make sure the contents, there is content aware, the mode is normal, and the opacity is 100%. So I press OK. When I press OK, Photoshop is going to automatically remove the subject from my background. It will do it. I told you my computer is a bit slow, but this thing should be really fast. So I'm going to wait as my Photoshop is filling up the space, filling up the subject. So after that, I can right click and say deselect. But what's up, guys? My blur background, the layer I named blur, it is now free of the subject. As you can see it right now, I have an empty background. But when I bring back my subject, so in this step I have separated the subject from the background. So I have two layers, the subject and the background. Yeah, I just named it blur because I have already the background. I keep this background just in case to keep it there. So guys, as I told you, I've separated the subject from the background. So the next step is even simpler. It is just a matter of applying blur in the background. So you go onto your filter after selecting this layer. You go into filter and then choose blur gallery. I told you there is lots of blur: average blur, blur mode, box blur, Gaussian blur, surface blur, shape blur, radio blur, motion blur. I'll be telling you all about those blurs. So I go on to blur gallery. I always prefer the field blur. I don't know why, but I just took this photo in the field, so why don't I prefer the field blur? You can always use the lens blur because I'm told it looks just like any blur from the lens. So I'm going to use the blur gallery and go into field blur. When you go into field blur, it is going to automatically come up. But in field blur, you have the options of increasing and reducing the intensity of the blur in this level. So I'm going to increase it to something like 17%, and I'm going to go on. I don't know, I think my Photoshop has some issues, but let's go. So I increase it, I vary it to something like maybe 200. But when you look at 200, it is something too much, but it looks beautiful. I think we should all agree. Look at this blur. It looks beautiful. We all agree. So you can reduce this to something like 30, 40, or 50. So I can go with something like 55 or 50. I think 48 will work just fine. So I just press OK, and boom! I have my image. I have my blur background. But in this video, I'm going to extend it even further to show you different blur options in Photoshop. So I'm going to press Ctrl Z to undo the blur I've created, and I go into filter, I go into blur, and I go into, let me use something like the radio blur. The radio blur, it creates some blur which is spinning. Let's see. So you see, look at this blur. It looks so beautiful. It looks so magical. So you can always play around with different blur options in this filter gallery. And you go into filter. I go into something called maybe motion blur. This motion blur, it shows the direction. There is a direction in which the blur can be moving. So when I create something like 160 pixels and I go, you can see this blur is somewhat moving. Sometimes motion blur goes well with the moving cars, running motorcycles, moving cars. It creates that sense of motion, but there is no motion in this picture. The model is just posing. So I'll be creating a video about different blur options, but in this sense, I usually use the blur. I go into blur and use field blur, and I increase it to something like 40 to 50. It depends on my preference, and then I press OK. So boom, you have your bokeh in an image. Remember, I took this image on the 50mm, and I shot this image as something like 2 to 4 aperture because I didn't Normally I don't have the high speed sync option to shoot some fast aperture. So I have created my bokeh in this image. And what else do we have? I think I'm going to give you another simple tip on how to enhance your background in Photoshop, and I think that should be in next video, but let me just give you 1 minute of it. So you go into filter and you go onto camera raw filter. When you go into camera raw filter, there is a secret you were never told. When you go into camera raw filter, there is something called the adjustment brush. When you press the adjustment brush, you can go on tapping onto those areas you want to enhance. You see, look at those areas I'm enhancing. Look at those areas I'm enhancing. So these areas you're enhancing, you can just edit them out, increase the contrast, darken out, or reduce the contrast to get this effect. And then you can reduce the highlights in those areas. You can add adjust, you can increase the temperature, you can lower the temperature. It depends on what you want, but that is the adjustment. You can dehaze the background. You see it is getting darker and darker and darker. The saturation you can increase it, or you can even lower it to get some black and white effects in the background like most people want it. I can increase the saturation, I can reduce the sharpness, and when I press OK, you can see the difference is even visible. There is this before and there is this after applying the adjustment brush. I'm going to be doing a video on how you can more understand the adjustment brushes in Camera Raw filter. I think that's a wrap. Thank you for watching this video. Peace. Yes, sir.